Welcome, now my hāpai, kia ora, mai no tātou katoa, ko Edwina Pio tāko inoa, he tangata Te Tiriti-aho, no reira tēnā tātou katoa. So welcome to the session on Islamophobia, acceptable discrimination, the use of language to sidestep the consequences of racism. I would like to thank our presenters, Anjum and Yassir, and also thank very much those who have worked in the background to make this webinar a reality. Thank you very much. Tēnā koutou, enga iwi, enga rio, enga monga, enga awa, tēnā koutou katoa. A few housekeeping rules. May I request the audience to mute their microphone, and if they have any questions, they are welcome to put their questions on Zoom chat or Q&A. Chat is preferred. You can type your message there, and I will read out the message for the presenters. A little bit about the presenters. And Anjum will be presenting first. She is a chartered accountant with over 25 years of experience, works in a range of organizations, is well known as a founding member of the Islamic Women's Council of New Zealand. She's a mother of two. She's a member of the Interfaith Choir, and she is very active in diversity aspects in New Zealand. Dr. Yassir Morsi is from La Trobe University in Melbourne. He has written a wonderful book called Radical Skin, Moderate Masks, De-Radicalizing the Muslim and Racism in Post-Racial Societies. And one of the lenses he uses is that of critical race theory. So we will have Anjum speaking first for about 15 minutes to 20 minutes, followed by Yassir, and then we'll have the questions and answers from the virtual audience, and finally closure from me as your chair, Professor Edwina Pio from AUT Auckland. So Anjum, would you like to go first, please?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Kia ora koutou. I'd like to begin by acknowledging mana whenua, their history, their struggles, and their aspirations. So I thought I'd start with the notion that racism these days is deemed to be an offensive accusation, more offensive, in fact, than actual racism. And given that the perception of being racist is so bad, people therefore find proxy ways to talk about race, which they can then quickly disclaim that they didn't mean race. And I'm going to explore that a little bit in my talk. Now, I wanted to preface that by saying that religion itself is not above criticism. There can be certain aspects of a particular belief system that can cause harm, and that needs to be discussed. There are times when some faith groups will prey on vulnerable people. So, for example, they may take advantage of persons in poverty, in isolation, or dealing with mental health issues. Those kinds of topics absolutely need to be discussed. There are times when aspects of faith are like cults, and there are lots of definitions online of what a cult is, but for me, a couple of the key aspects to a cult is one where they are removing people from all of their previous connections, and so isolating them from their support systems and networks that they had previously, and secondly, that they're asking for cash donations. And we have to recognize also that within religions, there are a multiplicity of debates on interpretation of text, on historical records, updating for new developments in human history. So there is a lot of vibrant and active debate within religion itself, and all of that is perfectly fine. But the thing with Islamophobia is that it goes beyond criticism or critique. We're getting to the stage where when we're being Islamophobic is where we're blaming all social ills on Muslims, when we're giving more prominence to crimes by Muslims than those from other communities, so that these crimes become headlines or front page news items, as opposed to crimes by other communities which are of a similar nature but are either not mentioned at all in media or given much less prominence. Islamophobia is about ascribing to the religion actions that are not based on religion. So, you know, when you compare with far-right extremism, you find the narratives of the lone wolf, of the mentally unstable person, whereas similar actions from a Muslim person are sheeted back to the whole community and are treated as an aspect of faith. And also part of Islamophobia is failing to recognise the geopolitical and historical aspects to certain actions, and either failing to mention them at all or dismissing them. So issues such as colonisation, issues such as demonisation in order to pursue illegal occupation and war, the impact of those wars and occupations feeding into terrorism, such as what we've seen in Iraq and the rise of ISIS, are totally discounted, and only the faith is brought out as a reason for behaviour. So one of the ways that people are talking about race without saying race is the use of the word migrants or immigrants. And we find, and I know that there is research to prove this, that often the word migrant and immigrant is used as a placeholder for a person of colour. It's very rarely used for white migrants. And you know that's the case because when we start talking about white migrants, often the phrases are used like, oh, you're the right type of migrant, you're the kind of person that we want. So, and the word migrant is often used for people from ethnic minority communities who haven't actually migrated. So, for example, someone like Saranan Satyanand, who is not a migrant but is often described as one. People use migrant when they mean a brown person or a person of colour from an ethnic minority community. And let me say that the word migrant itself should have no negative connotation. I would think that people who are migrants should be able to wear that identity with pride. I'm not at all saying that. But the fact is that the way that the discourse goes, that doesn't actually happen. When it comes to brown migrants, we talk about this lack of cultural fit. Those people that won't assimilate, those people that want to isolate themselves. And then we see that these migrants are blamed for things like unemployment levels. So they're coming here and taking our jobs. They're blamed for the housing crisis. They're blamed for crime. They're blamed for taking advantage of the benefit systems. But again, and it's very accessible research. If you go online, you'll find research from a multiple of countries that will show that the crime rate of migrants is much lower, significantly lower than the general population. Again, the research will show that migrants actually increase economic activity and contribute to the economy rather than being net takers from it. You'll find that the educational achievement and educational levels of migrants are much higher. And that is partly because our immigration systems are such that we pick the best of people from other countries. And so you would expect that to be so. But that fact runs counter this narrative of blaming ills on society, on these migrants. And of course, for refugees, they are expected to struggle. They have very little social capital as well as economic capital, and are also often failing issues of language, but also of their qualifications not being recognised and discrimination preventing access to the job market. So this notion of migrants and immigrants as a placeholder for race is very real, and it then becomes very easy to say, oh, no, I wasn't talking about race, but actually they were. The second area that I'd like to talk about is this notion of Islam being a religion, not a race, and it being a choice, and therefore not the same as a characteristic such as colour or ethnicity that is inherent to the person. That's all very well in theory, but what we find in practice is that the discrimination plays out as racial. So, for example, Muslim women who wear hijab and are identifiable as Muslims are treated very, very differently to white Muslims who are not identifiable. And we know that white Muslims do not get the same level of verbal abuse, harassment, and physical violence as they go about their daily business if they are not identifiable from appearance as being Muslim. And it is often people of colour, women of colour, or women wearing a hijab that are the subject of that. But furthermore, what we find is that people of colour who are not Muslim are abused as if they were Muslim. And both from overseas and locally, the Sikh community has suffered significantly from anti-Muslim hysteria in some cases, one can only call it. So they have suffered death, they have suffered physical violence, harassment, verbal abuse. We have instances in New Zealand of people of colour who are not Muslim being taunted as if they are Muslim. I can give you several examples, but one is of a gentleman who was walking past a Pakeha person who brushed against them, and when he turned around to say something, that person said to him, "Oh, 51 of you are already dead. Would you like to be number 52? And that person wasn't even Muslim. So this notion that that Islamophobia isn't about race doesn't in practicality play out that way at all. It plays out as race-based discrimination. And not to mention the fact that the majority of Muslims are people of colour. And so often when people are thinking about Muslims, they're thinking about Arabs, or they're thinking about brown people, and they're thinking about others. So all of that is a factor that gives lie to the theoretical notion that it is about religion. And another point that I'd quickly like to make is the fact that we fail to recognise that discrimination is often a causal factor in poor social indicators, and the use of stats as a discrimination tool. And this applies not just to Muslims, this applies to a lot of communities in this country and communities of colour. So underlying factors such as the fact that it is harder to get loans, such as the fact that if a certain number of people of colour move into a neighbourhood, we see this phenomenon called white flight. Inability to get rentals in particular areas, the ability to access employment. All of these are factors that lead to poor social statistics, but instead of those factors being recognised, often you will see those stats, and so we often see the incarceration rate for Māori and so on being used as factors to discriminate against them and to blame Māori for being lazy, for being failing to work hard enough, and all of those factors. So, and of course, in the use of those stats, it's like, oh, this is science, these are facts. It's presented as facts, but actually it is an interpretation of facts. So again, the use of stats to promote racism and actually be racist while trying to seem as if you're not being so. So the question, one of the questions I think that arises is it possible to talk about immigration without being racist? Of course it is. It's definitely possible. But I don't think you can do that if you don't first acknowledge the underlying racism in the political discourse around immigration. One needs to be upfront about that. Secondly, you need to not be making false accusations of migrants, such as the ones that I've already gone through, and blaming migrants for things that they haven't caused. And thirdly, that we need to be treating each person as valuable, regardless of what country they're from, and not treating them as if they're some kind of threat to us. And actually using Te Tiriti as a starting point for the discussion around immigration will be a huge help. And often you'll find that the people that are most anti-immigration and racist in their rhetoric around immigration are absolutely anti-Te Tiriti as well, and that's not a coincidence. So I just wanted to spend the last 3 or 4 minutes talking about a project that I'm currently working on in the space around anti-discrimination, which is the Inclusive Aotearoa Collective Tāhono. And that was a project that was developed last year, but the genesis was quite some time before that. But what we know is that we actually need a strategic approach to dealing with anti-discrimination, that this is not a problem that will be solved by individual action. Right? Discrimination requires collective action, and it requires a well thought out and strategic approach. And so that is why the Inclusive Aotearoa Collective Tāhono is looking to develop a national strategy on belonging and inclusion. And we've already started the work on doing that. And we have started by doing our road trip, which is now unfortunately on hold. And of course, we were quick to cancel meetings and so on as soon as we learnt more and more about the current threats we have with COVID-19. But we're not stopping the work. So we have spoken to groups of New Zealanders about belonging, and we are basically asking people 3 questions. First of all, when do you feel like you belong in Aotearoa New Zealand? Secondly, what is stopping you from feeling like you belong? And thirdly, what needs to change in order for you to belong? And we've kept these questions quite simple so that they're accessible to a wide range of New Zealanders. And already we've had some very meaningful and in-depth conversations. We will be continuing those conversations through online means, through Zoom and other means, but we also have on our website the ability to answer the questions at inclusiveaotearoa.nz. And once we have developed this strategy, which we were hoping to launch in December, but I suspect it will now have to be next year, it will be published on our website and be available to everybody to use as they see fit. But we will be taking 3 themes from the strategy and building work hubs or constellations around those. So this is a way for us to start developing collaborative work, collective work around dealing with issues of discrimination and a lack of belonging. So I'll leave it at that because I feel like I've talked enough. And I'll have a look at some of the comments that have been coming through. Thank you for people that have been sending those, and looking forward to hearing from Yassir.
Okay, so Anjum, thank you very much for that powerful sharing that you've done. I'd just like to highlight a few points that you mentioned. One is you spoke about brown migrants, something for the audience to think about. The aspect that the underlying discourse of racism and the fact that it's race that tends to be the underlying factor in terms of how people are treated. And also you mentioned about statistics being used as a discriminatory tool. I think it's important for the audience and for all of us to recognize Tiriti as a starting point. And of course, to treat each person as valuable. But I'd like to add that besides a macro strategy, each of us within our own span of control can also do things to make changes. So it's a multi-pronged strategy that we can look at when we look at Islamophobia. I'd just like to add a few more things on Islamophobia, which does have multiple connotations. Of course, as Anjum said, it's linked to anti-Muslim sentiment, discrimination, hatred, fear, harassment, and exclusion of Muslims from public life. The last concept I'd like to put in before Dr. Yassir comes in is that of intersectionality. So by intersectionality, we mean that a person is looked at not only, if I take the examples that Anjum has mentioned, in terms of religion, so wearing a hijab, in terms of gender, in terms of sexual orientation, in terms also of being a migrant, not a migrant, etc. And all these together impact how people view each other. So Anjum, thank you very much. A number of comments have already been made on the chat. And Yassir, now we look forward to your sharing. Thank you. Dr. Yassir?
Yes, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for having me. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, on whose land that I sit and work and benefit from. And to reiterate, this is Indigenous land, always has been, always will be. And, you know, we will continue to acknowledge that in all our anti-racism work. I'd also like to thank all the organisers for the opportunity and everybody listening for Anjum's beginning. And hopefully we can get a productive conversation and take a step closer to a collective combating of the many harms and that racism does to many, many people, including racists themselves. So I guess I'd like to start by kind of extending the conversation about how racism hides itself in opportune moments. Especially in a liberal society that both, I think, Australia and New Zealand profess to be, there is, as mentioned by Anjum, a recognition that racism is wrong, to the point that being called a racist becomes somewhat traumatic for many people. However, in Australia, although we tend to have conversations about racism a lot, we're not really discussing racism. What we are discussing is how racist white Australia is, and we're trying to create this kind of measure for what it is. And that takes away from, I think, the important ways that racism manifests, work, harm, and continues to survive in what is typically called a post-racial era. And here we find two aspects where Islamophobia is quite suited to continue racism in a post-racial era, to allow racism to hide, principally around the contest around what it means to be Muslim, which, as mentioned by Anjum, is often disputed because it's a religious identity, and the idea that being Muslim is, in a sense, one's choice. And if it's a choice, therefore you're open to all forms of criticism, and those criticisms cannot be racially motivated. But also the current war on terror, which stitches to debates around immigration, which stitches to debate about the nature and the violence and the illiberality of the other, the Muslim who, in the stereotypical sense, has less tolerance for other religions, is patriarchal, misogynistic, violent, allows a kind of ownership for liberal ideals to belong to the West. The idea that the West is the harbor of equality, justice, freedom, and so forth. And so the Muslim figure here comes in a way as almost to project all of the racial violence onto the Muslim, as that we as Muslims are, in a sense, the ones carrying forward all racial violence towards others, manifesting acts of terrorism and inability to accept Western culture. So the Muslim figure here has a kind of prominent role to play, not exclusively, of course. In Australia, whiteness here is still, till this day, manifests through its opposition to Indigenous peoples. And white Australia has built its identity off the misery and violence towards Indigenous Australians, but the Muslim here comes to kind of reinforce that existing whiteness. Which leads me then to ask a different question, to kind of move the conversation a little bit in a different direction. And that is, firstly, to begin with a definition of Islamophobia that has to consider and take into account this kind of post-racial denial, this foreclosure of racism as something that has built these nations. Now, typically, generally speaking, we kind of define Islamophobia as, it depends, but, you know, it's a hostility and a form of hatred, displeasure, fear, and so forth. And of course, the word phobia carries all of those connotations in its definition. But part of the problem with this is often we tend to define Islamophobia as a phenomena or a thing that lacks liberalism. Islamophobia is, in a sense, the thing that doesn't allow Australia or New Zealand to live up to its liberal standards of equality, tolerance, acceptance, rights, and so forth. Now, part of the problem of this definition is it kind of excludes implicitly or otherwise liberalism and its racial origins, or as a historical ideology in which, for the vast majority of its history, liberalism's idea of citizen, or the idea of the human in its humanism, was simply white. And, not just white, mostly white, male, and property owning. And property here, of course, is tied to notions of coloniality. But going back to that contest around the definition of Islamophobia, I think for us to move into conversations about how it manifests in this post-racial era is that we probably have to decouple it and question any definition of Islamophobia that is simply grounded in, let's say, a liberal language, which effectively means Islamophobia is the absence of liberalism. Now, I'm not here to be a critic of liberalism. I think things like rights, equality, and all of that are human endeavors. Freedom is essential to our experience. Being treated with dignity and respect, irrespective of where we come from and who we are, is, I think, a foundation of all ethical claims to good life, good society. So it's not that I want to take these terms and rubbish them, but I am cautious of how racism hides behind liberal ideals. And that is to say, I think a definition of Islamophobia that could help us move towards debunking the post-racial idea that we are now beyond racism is to recognize it and to tie it back to a long-standing historical attempt to effectively eliminate the other. Now, viewed as a scale, that's what racism is essentially about. It's about dispossession. At one level, the dispossession of land as something that us living in settler societies would know about. It's dispossession of my sense of self and culture and who I am from myself. So one of the realities of colonialism is displacement, and it ties to the waves of immigration. Second, third generation Muslims living in the West, we tend to come further and further away from a sense of self and have to continually navigate who they are, who they're not. So there's a dispossession of my own self from my culture. But there's also dispossession from your own body. And this is particularly pronounced through anti-blackness, where black doesn't become owned by black bodies. It becomes part and parcel of the racial narrative, right? So racism and Islamophobia, as one of its articulations, is a continual act of dispossessing who we are. I'm even dispossessed of the term Muslim when I have to continually navigate conversations about what it isn't, who I am, what my distance is to bin Laden, what my views are of my religion, how close my religion is towards humanism or a human rights-based ideology. So Muslim here becomes a question mark rather than an exclamation point of who I am. So these acts of dispossession are all about the elimination of another way of life that fall into the Eurocentric or Western. That, of course, at its most brutal, its most clear manifestation, is the actual physical elimination. That happens through genocide, through historical precedences and even contemporary ones, cultural forms of genocide as well. And it also, that thing which entitles somebody to walk into a mosque and shoot people up because they genuinely driven by this idea that I shouldn't exist. And so when we view that historically as what racism is about, then it becomes less and less about discussing issues like being tolerated or whether or not we are equal and so forth. That should be a given. But what happens when we discuss racism is too often we're confronted with, the lack of a better term, this type of white fragility where the person I'm interlocking with in this conversation wants to tell me how they're not a racist, how they believe all is all is equal, right? We're all one. We're all Australians. We're all citizens. We're all Kiwis, Aussies. You know, there's all sorts of markers at this sense. Now, that conversation does not eradicate or erase the fact that there is both a historical and contemporary violence that works to erase and eliminate people of color and Indigenous peoples from their land, their bodies, their sense of self, their wealth, and their heritage. And we have to spend significant amount of time to maintain that. I have to work 9 to 5 to effectively build up white supremacy. And then from a couple of hours in the evening, try to have my children connect to their heritage and culture against the grain so they don't wake up with a sense of displacement or disorientation about who they are. And so the reason I'll conclude partly on this is there are two effective racisms in that we're speaking about, and one is used to conceal the other. The racism of dispossession, displacement, and the violence, we'll call it a capital R racism. That racism is what grounded and built modernity as we know, built nations, the ones that we live in, built the economic system that prop up these nations at the exclusion, at the expense of Indigenous people and others in the global South. That capital R racism is 4 centuries plus old in the making. And then there's the small R racisms. You know, somebody on the train swears something and says, go back to where you came from and so forth. In Australia, I'm assuming similar to New Zealand, we are obsessively angered by the small R racism in order to conceal our relationship and benefit from the big R racism. So we'll show outrage when somebody tells me, you know, you don't belong here. But we will do very, very little to address the big R racism through reparations or material benefits that can begin to reverse the damages and the harms of capital R racism. Now, Islamophobia, I believe, has allowed many people to use small R racism to hide capital R racism by talking about the nature of the Muslim at the expense of talking about the colonial world that built up our experiences. Now, as a final point, I did want to mention something that I spent a lot of time studying, and that is the pressures that we as people of color, in this particular context that I'm familiar with, Muslims have to endure in order to navigate capital R racism first and foremost. So I carry a lot of pain, dislocation, sense of loss because I have to deal, I'm from the Egypt and the Middle East, and I cannot remember a single year of my life where violence wasn't part of that world. And that violence, there's a combination of factors. I've had to carry the consequences of that, dealing with that at one level. And then on top of that, you have to deal with the accusations of who you are and what you are and where you come from and what you believe in. So inevitably what happens is sooner or later we just put on masks. We just say what we have to say and we do what we have to do and we navigate the way we have to navigate. And in this sense, we kind of like succumb to the logic of not calling out the racist, because calling out racists and racism, traumatic act for the racist, for white Australia, and it often returns back in a series of backlashes. So I'll conclude on this point. And spaces such as the one that I've been afforded here today and opened up is important for multiple reasons. One, to solidify what we all know, to share what we know, but to remind ourselves of the masks that we have to wear and navigate, and essentially to keep on track of how racism continually tries to hide itself, including through our own actions when we just try to survive. So I'll leave it there. I'd like to thank again all those who have invited me and all those doing the work in the background. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yassir, for your expose. And again, like I did for Anjum, like to emphasize certain points. The big R and the small r, which I think is a wonderful way of putting racism and context, and also the historical attempt to eliminate the other, and two words that you mentioned, dispossession and displacement. Of course, linked to that is white fragility. So thank you for what you've shared. If I choose to be a bit provocative, I would like to say, let's also look at religion beyond Islamophobia. While the focus is Islamophobia, definitely, the point is that in many other parts of the world, we have had, let's say, you mentioned Egypt, or if we look at Sri Lanka, in the aftermath of what happened in Christchurch, as well as in other parts of the world, you get people with different religious orientations feeling that the other, whether the other is Muslim or whether the other is Christian or whether the other is a Yazidi or a Jew, being treated in a way that dispossesses them and displaces them. And to that extent, perhaps when we look at the treaty and the principles of the treaty, it's a wonderful learning point when we think of partnership, protection, and privacy. And what are we doing to see that each of us, whether it's the small r as well as the big R, how do we navigate being an individual in this world? How do we navigate who we are, keeping in mind that we need to look at decolonization as well. We need to look at intersectionality as well. And how are we using these aspects every day to reduce the microaggressions, to increase the microgenerosities? To, for example, reduce the ways in which brown people get left out, to reduce the ways in which brown people who might be Muslim, who might be women, get left out from decision making. So all that is linked in many ways to Islamophobia and the languaging that we use. So let's look at some of the questions. Can both the presenters see the questions?
Yes, I can. So would you like us to start?
Yeah, let's, Yassir, would you like to take a question? So for example, yeah, there's a question, could you please clarify the difference between big R racism and little r racism?
Sure. So I think because we're speaking partly on how racism today tries to hide itself from itself, there's an attempt, form of defense mechanism, like where we in these countries want to imagine ourselves as advanced, tolerant, and racism is a thing of the past. So unfortunately, because of this, there's been, maybe not unfortunately, but there's one aspect of small r racism has been overpoliced. And small r racism is the thing that if you ask most people on the everyday level what racism is, it will be reduced to an attitude. So you have a belief that your race is superior. It will be reduced to ignorance. It will be reduced to maybe fear of the other, a kind of xenophobia. And sure, these are all problematic and they exist, and I'm not trying to dismiss that. But that aspect of racism for me is the tip of the iceberg. And that small r, I call that small r racism because that's the kind of conversation around racism that we're having when I view other as inferior and I view myself as superior. Now, the big R racism that is below the tip of the iceberg is the historical, material, economic and political, centuries-old building up of a basically Eurocentric dominant world, first Pax Europe, Britannia, America, and so forth, where all other cultures and societies have to navigate this world. And this is materially constituted. So take the example of Indigenous Australia. Sure, there are attitudes, negative stereotypes, which are harmful and hurtful. but that's small r racism, and big R racism is the actual dispossession and the colonizing of the land, the lack of the treaty and the displacement, the material, physical, violent displacement. And so what happens is most of us want to talk about the impacts of capital R racism, and we just end up talking time and time again about small r racisms. And the point I was trying to make is we kind of use small r racism, condemn it, in order to foreclose the realities of big R racism.
Okay, thank you, Yassir. Anjum, would you like to pick up a question?
Sure. I wanted to pick up the one on Treaty of Waitangi and immigration, and the person was talking about how does this document guide us in treating migrants, no matter their faith, etc., when it was a document for British and Maori. I think in the modern world, if we look at the treaty, for me, it was a document between Maori and the Crown. And the Crown is now represented, of course, by Parliament. But in effect, if we look at migration through the lens of the treaty and the treaty partnership, then particularly as we come into the country, we, those of us that are coming in see ourselves as not just coming into a white settler country, but coming into a country with a strong partnership, with a place and a recognition of Indigenous people. It gives Indigenous people rights in terms of a proper partnership in determining what immigration looks like, but also it gives us a place to base our understanding of where we are in this country, and we are tangata tiriti, that is our place within it. And then, in terms of, I find that generally a struggle as a person of colour, the struggle has been within securing our space within tangata tiriti, that often tangata whenua have shown manakitanga, they have been welcoming, they have welcomed us onto marae, they show an understanding and a compassion that sometimes we find lacking in the space of tangata tiriti. And so I guess for us as well, that's the struggle of where we belong. So to me, Te Tiriti isn't just a historical document between British and Maori. It is a living document between the Crown and tangata whenua. And so when we develop policy with that lens in mind, I think that we would, one, have better policy. Secondly, we would have better understanding for people that are coming into this country and settling here, and then a better way of figuring out how we fit into New Zealand society as in terms of its structures and institutions. So that would be my answer to that question.
Anjum, thank you. And I would like to add that the treaty was, as you rightly said, between the Crown and the tangata whenua, Crown and Maori. So all of us are in reality guests for the tangata whenua. And therefore the term that you use, manakitanga, is something that's so important, and how we show it to each other. I'd like to continue that discussion, but there's a question from Deborah Howell. I understand in Glasgow, all immigrants are known as New Scots or refugees known as Glaswegians. Does changing the language in this way help? I'd like to respond to that. And I've had my research deals with ethnic minorities, including ethnic minority religions and the diasporic peoples, primarily brown people, at work and in enterprise and their migration trajectories. I think what is something to consider is when we think of ourselves in New Zealand, for example, and I talk about New Zealand because that's where I'm based, do we think of ourselves first as New Zealanders and then the other identities? Or do we think of ourselves first with our other identities and then New Zealand later on? So that's something I'd like to put into the mix, because that's the way of changing the language. There I also give the example of the USA, where many people, for example, might say, I'm an Italian American or I'm an Irish American, but bringing in the fact that they are part of that particular country where they have chosen to settle. For migrants, for example, it's a choice. For refugees, it often depends on if they are picked up by particular countries. So I do think definitely language is a way to help. But I'd like both Anjum and Yassir to respond to this and include in that. There is another question that has come up about English being predominant in terms of the language. And the question is by Lucy, can you talk about English language tests as a barrier to government jobs, such as teaching? So if both those can be taken together, that would be great in terms of language. And Yassir, would you like to go first?
Oh, okay, sure. Yes, language is incredibly important in the way we both imagine the problem, address the problem, and call out the problematic way we speak about others. So to answer the question by Deborah, I think it is, I do think things like that help, absolutely. I mean, it's to the extent of how much it helps is probably the debate that we're having. In certain instances, I think it would dampen the image of if you're a person of color, you're fundamentally different and othered. That said, you know, racists are racist, and they'll find a reason to weaponize and scandalize more inclusive language. So then we're hearing now political correctness gone mad, this and that, we're not allowed to say this and that. So the political will that motivates racism, both small r and it's capital R, is hard. What I'm trying to say is hardly going to be corrected through education, because the lack of education is not the thing that drives racism. Or so it does help. It would help, of course, especially those who are tired of being identified as inferior or other. But I think also we have to recognize that it's as likely to create different racial problems, because racism has a wonderful capacity of evolving and appropriating and adapting to anti-racism. And there's a lot more invested in racism than there is in anti-racism. On that point, very quickly to your question itself, about how one identifies. You know, I don't really call myself Australian or anything, not because I don't make it, well, I'm tired of continually having to prove it, but also I kind of think I'm looking towards building an identity that's not grounded in the nation state something. I think the world has to change to evolve our closeness. We only have to look at the way COVID-19 has spread. I think I'm trying to move towards global notions of who we are, and to kind of, I'm going to be blunt about it. I don't really have any, my heart doesn't sing for any of the kind of British colonial artifacts that majority construct up Australia's nationalism. I'm not tied to that. But I'm not really that tied to being Egyptian either, or, so for me, I'm looking, I mean, Edward Said speaks about being in exile and continually moving forward. And that's my conceptualization of being Muslim. So to answer your question, I don't really think about trying to prove I'm Australian, belong or not. I'm thinking about becoming, different ways of becoming, and being just and ethical in the way I'm becoming. Of course, that's grounded in my reading of my truth through Islam. But I've stopped saying I'm Australian. I really, forgive me, I can't be bothered. So I hope that answers.
Yes, thanks for that, Yassir. I want to add that I think Yassir is talking about global citizenship and moving beyond a nation state. He also mentioned a term that he picked up that I didn't pick up earlier, but which I'd like to mention now, which was white fragility. And those are aspects that we've got to consider. But I think as human beings, we're always going to have someone or something that is going to be other. The issue really is, how do we navigate and develop beyond racism? And if I could use words like compassion, kindness, dignity, those are the things that we can have in our lexicon and in our actions every day. Anjum, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. So I would absolutely agree with what Yassir said. First of all, I don't think that the words, you know, new spots or blaswegies, like what do we really need to change? This notion that migrants are evil and to blame for everything. Changing the name of that is not going to change the underlying concept, right? And so we need to challenge the concept that migrants are evil or so on, and we need to change who we mean by migrants as not just meaning people of color, and we need to change to not using the word migrant when we mean ethnic minority communities or people of color. Those are the things that actually need to change around language. And just giving us new names, I don't think, you know, does that mean that, you know, how long am I a New Zealander? I came here in 1972. Even that change in naming doesn't apply to me. I'm not new to New Zealand. So I think it is, yeah, I don't find those euphemisms or changes of language to be particularly helpful at all. And neither, you know, I'm very much also in that space of anti-nationalism. I don't care if I'm an Indian Kiwi or a Kiwi Indian. I don't think that's going to change anybody's view of me when they are deeply racist and when they think I don't belong here and don't want me here. The order of the names doesn't matter. And my commitment should be to humanity. And to, you know, to think, to buy into nationalism in that way, I find that it has only ever caused harm. And, you know, I mean, Yassir can speak more to this than me, but Australia Day is a day where a lot of people of colour would prefer not to go out of their homes, when it is supposed to be a day of celebration of national identity. In fact, it's a day of celebration of white identity. And so it really concerns me when I hear the likes of Peter Dunn and various other politicians and commentators saying, oh, we should scrap Waitangi Day and let's have a day like Australia Day, because what they're saying is, how do we find a way to suppress the voices of brown people? If that's what they want to emulate, they want to have national pride, but actually what they're complaining about is any expression of the experiences of colonization by those who have been colonized, which is what Waitangi Day is essentially about. So no, I think that their language does matter. I think there are changes that can and should be made to language. I just don't think this is it as a suggestion. Yeah. Oh, sorry, and I did also want to cover the English language tests. You know, that is a really difficult one. It's certainly proficiency in English is and can be a huge barrier to getting employment, and that embeds racism. And so the thing is, how do we deal with that? Because we do need some proficiency in language in a lot of the work that we do. And so it's about giving employers the tools. It's about putting in place support for employees. So for example, if you have to do a lot of written work, providing that support with someone who's a proofreader and so on, which we have done, for example, in Shama, you know, we find ways to support our women who need support with language, and we should, but that shouldn't be an automatic barrier to being able to get the job, because people can perform really well. And it works with people with disabilities too. Like when you see people in their deficiencies rather than their potential, and see supporting them as a cost rather than an investment into your employee, then of course, then that shuts out whole groups of people from accessing employment.
Thanks for that, Anjum. We have a few minutes more, and in the last few minutes, what I want to request both Yassir and Anjum, if you could pick up two issues that you think would help to move New Zealand, Australia, the rest of the world, if you will, towards a satisfactory situation with reference to religious diversity.
Okay.
Two.
Would you like to? Anjum?
Yeah, sure, go for it.
Yassir.
Okay, sure. So I think, broadly speaking, if I can answer this way, racism has many battlegrounds, and there has to be fought in different ways and different times. But I think to answer your question more directly, so the reason why I say that I think there's many different things that needed to be done, and therefore an education and awareness of how racism evolves and changes. We have to be more adaptive than racism is, because it always, I mean, it's 2020 and we're still debating about the right for people to live in dignity based on who they are. So for all the celebration that we're moved towards a more humanistic view, we're still here. So we have to evolve. So my anti-racism, to answer your question, will lead then to debates around protecting religious minorities. My anti-racism is really focused on self-determination and empowerment of minority groups for themselves. Too much of anti-racism at the moment is trying to fix white society, trying to educate white society, play therapist to white society, tell them we're not a threat. Too much of our energy, time, emotional labor, intellectual efforts. I mean, I never made a choice to be a critical race theorist. I was naive enough to think I wanted to be a philosopher, and then I read Plato and Kant and said, "Oh my God!" And then the war on terror happened, and then the next thing you know, I have to deal with racism. So a lot of it dislodges us from our ambitions in life to build a better world, to be in the contest to build a better world. So my anti-racism, to answer your question, is directly investing more. That's time, space, money, emotion into minorities so they can self-determine their own answers. The Muslim space is a contested space. It's not, all minority groups have contests within them and between them. It's just about bringing these conversations to the fore. So to answer your question directly in a more concrete way, public pedagogy will happen. Education will happen if we have more and more voices from below who are trying to determine the best way forward, and let it be a contest. To give you a very, very quick example of this.
Sure. I'd like to give Anjum time.
Sure, absolutely.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Of public pedagogy and self-determination, critical aspects that you mentioned.
Sure.
Thank you very much for that. Anjum.
So for me, it's very much a community empowerment model. So in terms of the work that we're doing, what it is for us is how do we create structures and how do we create a space where communities have the power and ability to decide what is best for them and to be resourced to implement that. And then the second point is often what we find is the way that discrimination plays out, the issues might be different for different communities, but often the solutions will work across communities. So just as I said around supporting of staff, can work for disability communities as well as for poor English language speakers. There are many things in that space where if we can start working across communities to implement the kind of solutions that will dismantle racism, that will dismantle the kind of structures that are holding us back, then we will have greater impact. And so I think that it's really important, and personally that's part of my work, it will be next year, is how do we create the spaces and facilitate the spaces that allow that to happen. And so we're going to trial that. Hoping that it all works, but I think it's really important because, as I've said before, and I agree, these are not things that can be solved by individuals. These are things that need groups to work together.
So, we have a little over a minute left to wind up. I want to thank Anjum and Yassir very much for sharing your thoughts, for bringing controversial ideas, if you will, to discussion, for sharing who you are in your career with us. And I'd like to close with a Tirio saying, Mori tu, Mori ora. So standing and moving together begets prosperity. We need to do what's within our own span of control, but we also need to look at larger structures. So the micro level, the meso level organizations, universities, and the macro level. Thank you to the audience for your questions. And all three of us our, we have our websites, we are available, and our research is also out there. Thank you very much, and salam, shalom.
Salam, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to both of you and for the panelists. It was a pleasure being involved.
Yeah, same.
Thank you so much.